If you've ever tried to climb a ledge in Assassin's Creed and ended up being swallowed by a haystack instead, then you know the pain of what I like to call fridge magnet platforming, in which it feels less like you're jumping and more like you're being pulled from surface to surface. One could claim 3D platforming is inherently more difficult than 2D platforming and requires some computer assistance, so Mario gets to have the freedom of misjudging a jump by 3 pixels and falling into a lava pit, while his countryman Ezio Auditore will have the universe itself bend the laws of physics to make sure he reaches a ledge. But Mario has gone 3D a long time ago without any compromises to the jump mechanic, and it was alright. Then they put him upside down and turned him into a fucking bee, and all remained well. It's almost like we're good at navigating 3D spaces because we live in one. Regardless, back in 2007, Ubisoft made the first of hundreds of baffling decisions to come by abandoning physics-based platforming for the sake of fridge magnet platforming, which they probably called something much fancier internally, such as predictive movement system or contextual traversal, to try and fool themselves into thinking it was a revolutionary idea instead of a shit-brained cum bucket. It restricts your movement to a collection of stiff pre-rendered animations tailor-made for specific situations. There's an animation for jumping a gap and another for jumping a larger gap, and the game will only let you jump if the animation for that type of jump exists. It has to know your destination before you jump, and I trust the predictions of a horoscope written by 2016 presidential election analysts over those of Assassin's Creed's programming. For the exact opposite of that system, we can look at Shadow of the Colossus, a platforming game where the platforms are gigantic moving creatures constantly trying to shake off the player, who barely clings on in a way that could only be more realistic if his arms were instantly ripped off. All this with 2005 technology, by the way. Also, some of the creatures fly and another swims deep underwater, something lead designer Fumito Ueda probably revealed to the development team from an underground bunker in an undisclosed location while wearing a shamanic headpiece to ward off their murderous hate waves. It wasn't ahead of its time. It kicked time in the teeth, picked them up from the floor and arranged them in a way that spelled fuck you, or intended to, before realizing there aren't enough teeth for the U and walked around looking for pebbles before giving up. It's a physics-driven system, even at its most basic. When you jump, you become a physics object in freefall, and the game doesn't have the slightest idea what's going to happen to you. The possible outcomes are innumerable, especially given that you're interacting with a giant dynamic object that is severely pissed off at you. When you start falling, you may be headed for the ground, but then an arm swings past and you grab it. Instead of having a huge library of ready-made animations, Shadow of the Colossus has a handful of physics-driven animations that can adapt to whatever happens. A freefall animation turns into a grab animation if you just so happen to come across a handhold, and the animations themselves are highly malleable, appearing to simulate inertia separately for each limb to an almost ragdoll degree. Now, granted, Shadow of the Colossus could be a bit finicky, especially on how well positioned you had to be to get on that fucking horse that handled about as well as an aircraft carrier on a tar pit, but the physics-driven platforming worked well most of the time and could lead to all sorts of unexpected outcomes and strategies, such as using the momentum of the Colossus trying to shake you off to launch yourself onto the weak point on its back. Imagine how boring it would have been if this was all contextual, with specific grabbing points that you could only jump to once prompted and then couldn't disastrously miss. And platforming has been physics-driven for long before Shadow of the Colossus. You don't need complex animation to call your platforming physics-driven, just a jump that's actually a physics simulation. Hell, Mario has always been physics-driven. His jump turns him into a physics object, a projectile, something that could be simulated even in the old days because it was a single sprite's X and Y coordinates, and getting a feel for his reach is important to win levels. Meanwhile, in Assassin's Creed, physics simulation is minimal. There's a lot of inverse kinematics at play, but the big thing, giving the player a nice free-falling jump to anywhere they like, isn't allowed. You can only ever jump from interactive spot to interactive spot as the game desperately cycles through its collection of stiff animations, not even managing to make them blend nicely. You constantly see sudden course corrections to fix alignment issues. It's the platforming equivalent of the RPG conversation, in which you must select one of 4 or 5 lines of dialogue. Yes, you have options, but they're limited and they're very specifically written because we're a long way away from procedural conversations, assuming it's even possible, and in fact seem to be moving away from them if Bethesda has any say on the matter. Yet perfectly capable procedural physics technology has existed for more than a decade, and we're still fucking about with bullshit like this. Look at this. I'm trying to jump to that square on the ground. For some arbitrary reason, I can only jump here. And here, I'm trying to use the climb down mechanic to descend from this ledge, but my character doesn't do so, even though there is an obvious ledge right beneath mine. Upon moving to another ledge of exactly the same type, suddenly it works. Why is this obviously stiff and arbitrary system in place? I think Ubisoft has a very precise, cool-looking flow in mind for their stitching together of ready-made parkour animations, and they don't want the player to stray from it with their selfish wishes to play the game. But if that's so, then Ubisoft's idea of flow is a half-clogged sewer pipe. There's a constant stop-start to the movement as the character bobs up and down across several small obstacles that could have been swiftly cleared by a single leap. To be fair, I don't think the system should be chucked out entirely. It just needs a physics-driven jump and less buttons being used for multiple things. Hi, Link! Come back here, you home-invading, vase-breaking fuck gobble.
Auto jump sucked!
I don't think automatically grabbing a ledge when you walk off it is necessarily good design, but the exact opposite of that is most certainly bad design. But my biggest problem was with setting too many things to the same button, as that requires that the game be able to distinguish different contexts, and if those contexts are hard to distinguish, there's going to be some confusion. In Shadow of the Colossus, the grab button is also the dive button, but being in water and not being in water are situations quite easy to tell apart. In Zelda though, the action button was responsible for making you roll, lift objects, drag objects, and climb objects, and it was easy to roll instead of lifting or climb instead of pushing. Navi herself told you to read what the action icon says at the top of the screen before you use the action button, and that's the point when you should throw your design document into a fire. The sentence, "you get used to it," doesn't usually indicate a good control scheme. Zelda fans are probably frothing in the mouth like disgruntled champagne bottles at this point, but relax, I'm not suggesting Zelda games weren't well designed. Mostly. Ubisoft recently started taking steps to fix some of Assassin's Creed's long-running issues. They stopped making the same button be used for sprinting and jumping, so that's a good start, although one wonders what uncharted depth of utter stupidity led to that even being implemented in the first place, probably because of that bullshit anatomic control system in which the lower button was responsible for everything leg-related and the top button was responsible for everything head-related. A system that sounds like something a person who never played a video game in their life would come up with. That was recently scrapped from the franchise as well. There's a button entirely dedicated to swiftly climbing down now, an addition that came with Unity, in which Ubisoft announced like they were the first ones to think of it, 7 games after everyone else had thought of it, but alright. So the free running isn't as prone to mistakes now, and the parkour works pretty well on the ground, with the player character vaulting over obstacles or just dodging them without accidentally climbing anything, but it all still amounts to a polished turd. It just isn't fun. You don't get to make your own way, create your own shortcuts, die due to your own fault, the way a physics-based jump button would allow. You give us revolutionary Paris and Victorian London, but keep us constrained to the things you thought of, instead of giving the player the freedom to come up with their own paths. It's like a driving mechanic that doesn't let you go off-road. Fridge magnet platforming has popped up in other games. In the Arkham series, you can freely glide Batman around with great precision, but his jumping is context sensitive. Here I'm trying to lightly hop to the ground, but I ended up perched on a narrow surface instead. No problem if I could simply and discreetly hop down from it with a quick tap of the jump button, but Batman can only do a bizarrely desperate leap forward, after which I swiftly enter the floor grate more out of embarrassment than anything else. If you want to stealthily position yourself behind an enemy, your best bet is to open your massive cape and glide down majestically. Shadow of Mordor uses the same system, though the problem is mitigated by how sparse and simple the architecture is, so it's harder for the game to misinterpret you, but still boring. For possibly the worst non-Assassin's Creed example, there's Enslaved, a game I love for many reasons, but with platforming segments that felt like busy work because they were stiff and impossible to fail unless there was some time limit. The game wouldn't let you miss, and the climbing paths were easy to figure out. Some of the climbable objects fucking shimmered, so there was no challenge to any of it. You didn't even have to be directly aiming at a handhold. Just keep pressing the jump button while kind of pointed in the general direction of where you wanted to go, and that was it. The platforming animations were also shit. I'm not sure there were animations for some movements, more like a clumsy blend from one handhold to the other. Uncharted 4 is more of a hybrid. You can fail a jump if you jump too early, but jumping too early is so counterintuitive it hurts to do it. Jump at the moment it feels right, and you never miss a ledge. Mechanics like the piton and the rope are more malleable, but underutilized, frankly. The game never put a truly complex sequence in front of you, requiring good timing, quick thinking, and efficient swinging all at the same time. It was always a bit too simple, one thing at a time, and I say that as someone who loves the game. There were ways to play with the mechanics more creatively. Titanfall 2, for instance, had some extended free-running sequences that allowed for 0 errors, and they were immensely fun. If Uncharted 4 also went ahead and made jumps more dependent on skill, it could have made for some great challenge. Why do games with nice rope swinging mechanics have like 1 or 2 grapple points every 45 minutes or so? Let us swing, you bastard! What I'm arguing for is a physics-based jump mechanic that gently helps you when your destination is something like, say, a thin pipe or a tightrope, but otherwise depends entirely on your skill. That's how it works in Dishonored, Dying Light, Mirror's Edge Catalyst, Titanfall 2, all of which are first-person games, which leads me to wonder how much of this is down to animation. First-person games are easier to animate even when you can see the player's body, because you rarely do so and you only have one perspective. This is what Faith looks like when you're controlling her in Mirror's Edge Catalyst. In first-person, when you want to turn, you just turn. Same is true of third-person games where the player character's orientation is locked to the cameras. Those ones are obviously harder to animate than first-person, but not by much if compared to the nightmare of third-person games with independent 360 camera movement and feet feet always being visible. This is what animators talk about in therapy. The player character may be facing the camera, and given that, in order to turn, the player may simply press forward, which requires a specific turning animation that often ends up a bit sluggish and unwieldy because it's very hard to make it responsive and convincing. So much so that Bloodborne, a game very dependent on responsive controls, just throws its hands up and lets the player swivel like a gothic spinning top so that the act of turning only affects rotation and not translation. The stop running animation is also very precise. Some games stop gradually with the player character ending up a few inches or even a foot ahead of where the player wanted so that it looks convincing, but in Bloodborne you just stop dead exactly where you want to, no matter how unnatural it may look. And those are just two aspects of how challenging it is to animate from this kind of perspective. Ubisoft may restrict the player's movement because that is necessary to maintain maximum animation fidelity. Problem is, Assassin's Creed's animations look jerky and stiff even then. They don't flow well, and that is probably because Ubisoft is addicted to motion capture animations and doesn't add many handmade tweaks to them. They ignore one of animation's most important tenets: slow in, slow out, which I'm going to call easing because sometimes it's fast in, fast out. Look at Joel's vaulting animation in The Last of Us, which isn't even a platformer. Fluid, isn't it? It begins fast, slows at the peak, and ends fast. It's an exaggeration of how it would look in real life to add fluidity. And look at Inside, which genuinely has some of the best animation in gaming history. If they were based on motion capture, it's no longer possible to tell. Inside's animations look better than real life thanks to an absolutely perfect and wonderfully subtle use of easing, which adds weight and flow. It's no exaggeration to say that Inside's animations keep it fun to play, because movement alone feels so good. It's not just the puzzles, it's how it feels to interact with the world, every action being rewarded with gorgeous looking reaction. The new Tomb Raider is also very freeing, with an entirely physics-based jump, perhaps a bit too maneuverable in mid-air, but still, and what may be the most satisfyingly fluid ledge climb animation ever made. Assassin's Creed isn't even well animated for the standards of a fridge magnet game. Shadow of Mordor also uses the same system, but the free-running animations at least feel satisfying with real weight to them. Assassin's Creed's animations don't have that, they feel weightless. The animator is supposed to come in and make it all blend nicely and feel satisfying to look at and to control, but it's like Ubisoft is afraid to lose any realism. They shouldn't be. This kind of handmade tweaking only ever stands out in live-action movies because of the contrast with real human beings. In an entirely digital world, it looks great. Sure, don't go full Pixar unless your game is cartoony, but there is some beautiful middle ground that doesn't sacrifice realism. Also, Ubisoft, if you care so much about realism, why is Assassin's Creed's Ragdoll the literal worst in the AAA industry since the first game? But perhaps the game that best exemplifies what I'm defending is infamous Second Son. Now, some differences do have to be highlighted. It's a superhero game, so protagonist Delsin Rowe moves with a natural speed and vigor. Sure, Assassin's Creed's climbing isn't realistic either, but there is a difference, alright? Delsin's jumping and climbing is physics-based almost all of the time. Yes, the climbing as well. Delsin kind of jumps off the wall to a certain height if you keep pressing X, which can look a bit fidgety as if he's desperately trying not to slip on a wet surface, but it's very freeing and responsive. Most of all, his jump is one of the best animated jumps ever produced. It looks great, feels great, and is pleasantly maneuverable. Purely physics-driven until the game detects a foothold or handhold and has Delsin interact with it in a way that feels natural. The game helps you in just the right ways, so you don't need pitch-perfect precision to land on a narrow surface, but you can still miss it or intentionally ignore it without being pulled to it against your will. For the sake of relative realism, I'd keep the climbing in Assassin's Creed mostly the way it is, but a jumping mechanic like this would make exploration so much more fun and movement so much more precise because the game would no longer need to predict where we're going, we could just tell it. So make the animations flow, keep us from entering haystacks unless we press an interaction button, and add free physics-based jumping. I suggest pressure sensitive so that a tap of the button leads to a hop and holding it leads to a leap. Some maneuverability in the air might be nice as well for subtle course correction, though not so much it looks like the player character has attitude thrusters around his body. And by the way, automatically grabbing a ledge when walking off it should be something you can disable in an options menu. Speaking of which, last thing, what I'm suggesting makes games harder for differently abled people. So do like Uncharted 4 did, and don't forget to add optional facilitators such as jump assist for the sake of accessibility. Games should do that in general anyway, especially letting us remap buttons. I mean, come on. While I'm making suggestions, I'd also like to suggest something for Uplay. Shove it up your